ByuN is back, ladies and gentlemen. The Puppy Terran returns. One of the most exceptionally exciting Terran players in the Starcraft 2 scene, ByuN, is back. ByuN, of course, is most famous for having the best micro in Starcraft 2, winning a GSL when he was teamless. When if you look at the GSL winners in general, most of them not only had belonged to a team, but were on a Kespa team. And ByuN was also one of the old school guys who was a part of the very first couple GSLs and came back into the Legacy of the Void era and won. So ByuN's initial GSL championship that happened in 2016, it's one of those GSL championships that carries a lot of weight for a player's career and for the metagame, because this was a time in which not only was ByuN sort of setting the standard for what you're supposed to do as Terran, he was doing so as some of the best micro we've ever seen. And if you're unfamiliar with this era, this was sort of right around the beginning of Legacy of the Void. Not at the very beginning, but in the early days of Legacy, 2016. And there were a few things that ByuN did exceptionally well. The first that comes to mind is the 3-Rax Reaper cheese. Now, if you've played any amount of 2v2, you certainly know what this is. But if you're a strictly 1v1 player or a newer player, this was a cheese Terran did off of one base where they would build 3 barracks and do mass Reapers. And the Reaper was way more strong than it is now. And basically, you could just shave off infinite amounts of units. And ByuN not only popularized this build, but mastered it. If you look at the history of StarCraft 2, a lot of times builds will become popular and any top player of that race will do that build, but oftentimes there will be one person who truly has mastered the build, and the build almost becomes as much a part of their person and tactical overview as a player than it does just a meta thing that people do. And even though the 3-Rax Reaper was play that we saw mixed in from players in general, this was definitively ByuN's build. And he was so good at it, he got it nerfed. Another good example of this is parting in the Soul Train Immortal Sentry All-In at the end of Wings of Liberty. Yeah, a lot of people were doing that build because it was exceptionally powerful. However, parting was the one who mastered the execution. And if you were to just say Soul Train Immortal Sentry, who did it best, any seasoned veteran watcher of StarCraft 2 would be able to tell you that was definitely Parting's build. He mastered that. Another example is the 12-minute Roach Max versus Protoss in late days of Wings of Liberty. Stefano mastered that, and we can see ByuN's signature unit, the Reaper, is going to come in and see a little bit of Robo. But this commentary, not so much about this 3-year-old game, and it's more about hard-hitting news. So to wrap up on ByuN, everyone should be exceptionally excited, even non-Terran players. This is a guy who has some incredibly flashy micro. He brute forces stuff like you wouldn't believe. In terms of frequently in StarCraft, if you opt for an aggressive build and you reach your opponent's base, perhaps they've been preparing for it, they know or suspect what you're doing, and you get there and holy crap, they have so much stuff ready, and there's no way it's going to be able to work. ByuN is the master of brute forcing his units into working in those situations where you arrive and it looks like there's no way in hell it will ever work. ByuN was just so good at making those situations work. Notice he's taken the tower before he does the drop. That severely increases the chance he can make a beeline to the natural without being spotted. Well, he's taken it with a mine. He knows nothing's there. Which, whenever you're going for aggressive play, the point still stands. With ByuN coming back, it's a very important thing for the StarCraft 2 scene because Deer, a top flight StarCraft 2 Protoss player who, if you look in terms of GSL Korean Protosses, you have Stats, and Zest, and Parting, and those guys are very good and very consistent. And then you got Deer and Trap are both very good, but that's sort of like the upper echelon of Protoss players. And the SOS, you kick around. SOS is super inconsistent though. Tasteless made a really funny joke whenever he said, with SOS, it's sort of like you have to determine whether or not the ayahuasca is hitting him correctly that day. Sort of just making fun and making a point of, holy shit, that would have mine. Just sort of making a point that SOS does crazy off-the-wall shit, and sometimes when he loses, it just looks so appalling and looks like SOS is clueless. And when SOS wins, he looks like a fucking genius. And to me, I think SOS plays Protoss perfectly in terms of the tactical way he approaches the game. He will do the most greedy macro openers out there, eco cheeses if you will, and he'll do the most insidious, ridiculous all-ins. And I think if you play Protoss, that's the range of builds you should have. You look at a player like Stats, he almost never cheeses. He almost never even does timing attacks. Like, the guy feels guilty and shameful about not taking a second and third gas. Third and fourth gas, rather. I guess second would still sort of apply in some builds. But the point is we saw Stats lose in the GSL finals pretty badly a few days ago. And a lot of that is because he doesn't cheese. I love watching Stats, and pure macro players that grind people down are my favorite stylistically. Innovation, Idra, Artosis, Stats is like this, pure macro. But to me, Protoss isn't really supposed to be played like that. And it's very exciting that ByuN's coming back, but we just came off the heels of an exceptional GSL, so I'll talk a little bit about that. The next GSL is coming up, and like I said, ByuN has already qualified, but if we take a look at this last GSL, I'm going to talk about the groups a little bit. Group A, we had Zest and Special Advance, and Zaun, a no-name toss, and Sue did not advance to the next round. And very, very tragically, Sue peaked 3 years ago, but is in this melancholy search for his first title. And in the past, whenever Sue was at his peak, it was like he was a perennial contender for the finals, and it was just a matter of he would run into buzzsaws of people having the premier season and lose. And of course, Sue is the leader of all-time second place finishers without a first. And one thing that's sort of interesting to me is that if you look at the history of Starcraft 2, and specifically the GSL, a lot of times what you had was players who were just absolutely at their peak at an unbelievable god tier level where it was truly their season. All the stars lined up and it looked like they had no way to lose. That's exactly how the season in 2016 that ByuN won, that's how it looked for him, as we can see ByuN using 3-prong drop harass. And this is the sort of thing that made him good. He was always good about forcing his opponents to make mistakes and then out multitasking him on the micro front. Whereas a player like Innovation gets ahead of you by making more units than you, not missing depots or upgrades, and grinding you down and having more stuff than you. ByuN out micros you. He's very annoying. And I don't mean that in a pejorative or mean sense. He's annoying in the sort of way that you want to be annoying when you play Starcraft. And it's just such a pleasure that we're going to have him back, because he really doesn't play like anyone else, and we're going to be losing deer, like I said. So you lose one quality player and get another back. I've oft wondered what StarCraft would be like if Koreans didn't have to do mandatory military service, because then you would have a lot of like going into becoming quote unquote older, like the baseball equivalent of being like 36 or 37. Is like a pro gamer when he's like 26, 27, if you're Korean at least. Is you're going into your ages where you got to complete your mandatory military service, and a lot of times once a Korean pro gamer has to do that, especially if they're middling, that's it. They never come back, or they never reach even close to the same form. It's actually pretty rare, as we see at Depth Harass, for players to come back and be as exceptional as they were before. And to me, when you look at this last season of GSL, DRG's run really sticks out of you as an example of that, because DRG is 2012 through and through, and this guy has really got 2012 through his veins in terms of the style he likes to play, especially versus Zerg, his titles and peak. This guy is a Wings of Liberty player, and he absolutely ripped through some of the best players we've ever seen in StarCraft history. Innovation this season looked like he was untouchable, especially versus Zerg. And Innovation, for me personally, is probably my favorite Korean Terran. He's just so fun to watch. I love the way that he grinds people down with macro. And Innovation had a very hard group. He obliterated Dark in the round of 16, and then he lost to Parting, who, if you remember, was showing off those Observer, Warp Prism, Blink builds. And whenever you look at an aggressive Protoss player like Parting, how does he do well? What sort of metagames does he do best in? And in which situations does Parting have the best chance of winning GSL? Well, it's when he comes up with a newfangled aggressive build that people aren't used to. Whenever you take a player who's as good as executing aggressive builds, both micro and macro wise, as Parting, and he first shows them off in the GSL, especially against Terran and Zerg, well, I guess even against Protoss too, because PvP is so volatile, it's just something that's very hard to deal with. And as a Starcraft player, whenever you see something that lethal being executed by someone it fits stylistically so perfectly for the first time in a tournament game, that is very troublesome. And that is how we saw Parting do a lot of damage in this round of 16, because not only did he beat Bunny, but he beat Innovation. And you know how you know when a sort of GSL flavor of the month build is good and successful and has merit, whenever the latter just gets destroyed by it for the next few weeks. If you ever play StarCraft and don't watch GSL consistently, sometimes, let's just say you're a Zerg player and you play against a few Protosses in a row that ladder session. It's like, Jesus Christ, what is going on? Like, why is everyone doing this like weird Archon build? And then it turns out that previous night, Stats and Parting both did Archon drop. And suddenly it becomes meta for 3 weeks. And if you don't watch GSL, you can be like, where the hell did this come from? No one did this before and now everyone's doing it? What's going on? If you're like in Platinum League, you might have experienced this phenomenon and not really understood. It happened in GSL, is the punchline. And to me, if you look at a season of GSL, a lot of times you can point and say, oh yeah, that's that season where X player did X build. And with ByuN, the season he won, it was ByuN was doing quick drop builds and 3 racks Reaper and executing them better than anyone. And in this last season, where Parting did pretty damn well, he was doing the robotics quick blink 5-gate pressure versus Protoss. And he did lose in the round of 8, and if you watch that series against TY, those were some close, weird games, and Parting is a very emotional player and sort of looked like he was rattled a bit during that series. And if we keep it in the round of 8, by far the most shocking game was DRG versus Innovation. I think that Innovation looked so good versus Zerg, and I would have been willing to wager $1,000 at even money that Innovation was going to beat DRG, and I was fairly confident it would look very good for Innovation. Innovation is perfect at the mid-game and mid-late game moment of ZVT, grinding the Zerg down into nothing and using his superior macro to execute a foothold advantage into game-winning, game-deciding type damage. And Dong Regu played a mid-game focused style just like he had done all season and just like I figured he would. And just like he's been doing his whole career, a style that was on paper supposed to be perfect for Innovation to counter. It looked like what Innovation did was excellent against how DRG liked to play, and DRG fucking obliterated him. If you haven't seen those games, the series was over. It was a GG from Stats as ByuN comes back. I'm going to wrap up my thoughts here. The series was over in 40 minutes, and it was supposed to be a one-sided Innovation victory. Innovation predicted 3-0, and it was just a one-sided browbeating. And in the same way that in the GSL, players can sort of revolutionize or popularize certain builds in a season, and that can become synonymous with them, I feel like a player can look like they're on a magical run and have a misstep in the round of 8 or round of 4, and then the person who beat them, almost like, especially if you're a fan of the person who you thought was having a magical run like I was for Innovation, it sort of felt like DRG wasn't supposed to win. Even though DRG had looked great and was a great story and a lot of people liked him, including me, it looked like Innovation was untouchable. And Innovation got stomped in the very next round. DRG just got embarrassed by Rogue. 4-0, one of the quickest round of 4s ever. And I was saying to myself, God, Imagine if DRG hadn't showed up to the studio and Innovation had and faced Rogue. They probably would have had a knockdown, drag-out 7-game series. Or hell, maybe Inno would have gotten 4-0'd by Rogue next, because that was just so bizarre to see someone flying that high get bopped that badly. If you watch the GSL, or you don't watch the GSL, I would recommend watching it, and I would recommend watching it every night. And if you have to work, and your work schedule means that you can't watch it live when it airs early in the American morning, the VODs are up there on YouTube every day. As soon as the broadcast is finished, the whole VOD's there. You can flick through it. It's not like the old days of GOM TV where the 480p plus feed was paywalled. So you don't have to worry about that. The games are out there, and it's Tasteless and Artosis casting, and neither one of them ever really miss any days. It's just perfect. If you're a hardcore StarCraft fan, the GSL is what you should watch. The GSL and the Venomous Classic series, Kipo. So to wrap up this video, I just want to talk briefly about the best pro gamer in the world in any esport, Flash, aka God, the ultimate weapon, switching to random, when of course he played True Terran. Now Artosis said it best, Flash is bored. Flash at this point can beat anyone in the world pretty much with ease, and it looks as though he's gotten bored of Brood War. And a few months ago we saw him sort of float the idea of retiring, and this just was very upsetting and just so foolish. Because whenever you're the best in the world at something, by far, you're like a legitimate bonjour, where people really look up to you, like all sorts of people from different walks of life. You're like the best in the whole fucking world, pretty much the Jordan of your shit. To say you're gonna retire is goofy. And I think Flash sort of sensed, like, what the hell am I gonna go do, get a job? Like, you know how many people like watch Flash on Afrika and like hang on his every word? Afrika is like Twitch TV for Koreans. It's like the Korean live streaming service. But anyway, Flash is a god and everyone knows it, and for him to retire like he was going to a few ASLs ago was silly, and I think he realized that. But he was just bored of like owning people with Terran. You have to imagine, in a top tier KT Rolster Brood War team house, when he was in all these MSL finals, Flash was probably playing like endless 12-hour days, grinding against like top tier A teamers endlessly. And at this point, like, Flash is at the point in his life where he wants to chill more, and like stomping people in ASL and super tryharding isn't really what he wants to do anymore. So he played random, and he's pretty much saying it's not like a gimmick, he's going to switch to full-time random. And there was this show match series that Tasteless and Artos had casted a couple weeks ago where Flash played random. He played three-game sets versus people. It was like a Zerg and 2 tosses, and they were good players. And of course, he gets mirrors in half the game, which like fucks it up and makes it unfun, and it's just stupid, because if you're a veteran StarCraft player and you've played a bit of random, you know that mirror matchups are like, if you're playing a race that you're not as familiar with, mirror matchups are these weird, finicky things where the person who has more experience is far more favored than in non-mirrors. So Flash sort of lost the mirrors because he had less experience, and then there was it just was weird and bad because you had the best player in the world who could annihilate anyone with Terran sitting there like playing ZVZ in PvP. And for some people it was like, well, we're gonna see if the best player in the world can like off race and beat people, and that's like so cool. And to me, what's more cool is seeing the master, the legitimate like #1, can't be disputed #1, do his thing. Like, it's infinitely more entertaining for me for Flash to just like obliterate top tier pro gamers with this godlike macro than it is to like watch him play it. Like, if you look at the players in the ASL, like a round of 24 ASL quality Zerg, like, oh, like Flash beat Mini with like an overpool, like who gives a shit? Like, I'd rather see him play perfect Terran. And I feel like if you really appreciate the game and care about the game's history and really get what the game is about, it's not really about like the shock value of like, oh, Flash is playing Toss. Like, okay. Like, that's like Eddie Van Halen playing keyboards. Like, it's not awful. Like, he's still good at it, but like, wouldn't you rather see him play guitar? Like, what he's a go-to at? It was, you know, like, this Flash playing random announcement is like the Van Halen album 1984. Like, it's still good, but keyboards? Like Protoss and Zerg? I don't want to see Flash play Protoss and Zerg. Like, think about it. It's an ASL day. Oh, Flash is on. I can't wait to see him. Best player in the world. He plays random and gets a fucking like PvP and loses, and then plays a Zerg player and loses EVZ. Like, wouldn't you have seen Flash play like a perfect versus Protoss and a perfect versus Zerg, both with Terran? I just don't get the appeal of him playing random as far as a viewer. I see why he's doing it as far as a personal decision, but overall not a fan of that. But I am a fan of GSL, I am a fan of ByuN returning, and I hope you guys enjoyed this little video where I just talked about the scene a little bit. It wasn't necessarily focused on the gameplay. I'm sure there will be one guy very, very angry about the fact that I wasn't like pointing out the Reaper going in the guy's base the whole time. So peace out, sub for more.